It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Hello and welcome to After Reading. I'm Tim Peterwriter, and with me today is a guest whose podcasts I've graded a couple times, I think, at least once. Joe Compton, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Tim. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you. And tell everybody a little bit about yourself and the shows you host and the books you write.
Sure. So my name is Joe Compton. I write crime thrillers currently. I have one book that has been out for a while called Most of Killing, and a second book that will be debuting March 12th of this year called We the Moral Majority. It's the sequel to Amongst the Killing, and they're both crime thrillers, as I said. And I run and operate the online network GoIndieNow, which is kind of a pseudo-television network, I guess you could call it, in terms of I publish and produce several shows that go along a scheduled timeline, and we do those weekly, monthly, seasonally, and they're all about indie artists and what indie artists do and how they do it, and we promote and help support indie artists. So that's me in a nutshell.
It's a terrific channel. Yeah, I really like GoIndieNow. Actually, I've been perusing the contents more than once every so often now. So when I'm not busy burning my brain out trying to write ad copy and dictate new books.
All the time that we would wish that we all had, right?
Oh, of course. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a huge podcast listener. That's kind of why I started this show, and I started podcasting in general. But I just don't have time for these podcasts because, I mean, it used to be okay. I used to be able to write while I listen to podcasts, which I know people will say that's insane. But now that I'm talking my books, that's just not possible. Can't listen to anything while I'm doing that. The heavy metal also took a hit there. Anyway. So it's crime thrillers, huh? Cool.
Yes.
Actually, I've talked to a fair few thriller-ish authors on here, various types and sorts. But what kind of, you say crime, but can you be more specific about the sort of conflicts and stuff your books deal with?
Sure. They mostly deal with following a specific, either the FBI or the LAPD, robberies, homicide, and it's just basically, it's basically following, crimes that are occurring and, kind of timelining it where we go through a specific moment in time and follow what they're doing and how they're doing it and the things they're thinking about. I write from first person perspective, so usually you get an idea of how they're thinking of why they do what they do and when they do it, and so it's kind of how I explored it. And I didn't initially start out with that specific idea in mind where it was going to be police procedurals or something to that effect, but it just fit the narrative, and I kind of embraced it and ran with it. I did a lot of research around it, and so I was in the military, so I kind of know how that kind of structure works and things like that. So it just made a lot of sense, and I've kind of just embraced it and done it. Walked around with it and made it happen. So
nice. And these books, so do you follow? They follow different characters, and you say one was a sequel to the other.
Right. Yeah. So the first book is an introduction to a robbery homicide detective in his youth when he's kind of captured the dream job of his life. He always wanted to be a robbery homicide detective, and in doing so, he gets assigned a case that kind of changes his perspective in more than one way, and he is directly affected by the perp in which he's chasing, who turns out to be a mass murderer. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of their story back and forth. I tell the story in dual perspective. So basically, one chapter is written by the detective, and then the next chapter is written by the murderer. And it's just following their story all the way through to to a somewhat conclusion. And then the sequel continues some of that story of some of those characters and some of the ancillary characters that were involved in the first book get a little bit more play in the second book.
Okay, cool. So it's not a direct, like, this is the same character, this is just a different case kind of sequel. It follows a different, character.
It's a different part of their life.
Okay.
It's a time. It's more following the time period of their life. There is one case involved in both the sequel and the original, but it's really about that time of their life where they're kind of moving from being younger to more middle-aged, and how they're dealing with that, and how their perspectives have changed, and how it's skewed, and how how they deal with who they are at the time that they are that. So.
Oh, that sounds really cool. I especially like it. Kind of reminds me of the first season of True Detective, the HBO series, from the way you're describing it. I mean, just because it covers this large span of time in the course of one book, more than a few months or even weeks or whatever. Because a lot of books, especially thrillers, I would imagine, are more fast paced. That's what I've experienced with when I read them. It's like this book's going to take place over like 3 or 4 days, maybe, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
As opposed to a kind of more psychological approach.
Absolutely. And I come from a screenwriting background. I wrote screenplays before I wrote novels, and this actually started as a screenplay. And what ended up happening was I was like submitting it to contests, and what ended up happening was people were telling me, "Oh, I really think this is a terrible movie. Would be a terrible movie, but it'd be an interesting novel to read." And I never thought of it that way. So, and then one day I just embraced that and ran with it and started writing it, and it turned out to be the way it ended up. But it is very much like that, where we're following characters who have, not necessarily flaws, but have some things going on that make them more interesting as people, and not just following what the crime itself and how they're dealing with the crime. That's part of it, but it's really about how they are as human beings. I find that more fascinating than just simply. I mean, solving a crime is kind of neat, but it's not. It can be kind of bland, and so
I totally understand that. I'm not a huge consumer of crime fiction or Law and Order type stuff or whatever. I see that goes how far I know about the stuff that's on TV right now. Gosh, Law and Order, whatever. I don't want like cop shows, that kind of thing. Not really my forte.
Not mine either, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. Do you write other sorts of stuff too, or is this sort of the only books you got out there? I mean, you said you were wrote. What kind of screenplays were you into?
Yeah, I made a comedy and a couple horror films. And you could pretty much say that the comedy was a horror film, but that's a different story. And that's a different perspective on probably what was really a comedy. But I mean, it's really, I've always gravitated toward, like, I don't know. I've always been all over the place. I've always enjoyed multi-genres. Especially in movies. If you look at my top 10, you probably think that I was insane, because I have foreign films, I have comedies, I have sci-fi, Shakespeare. I mean, I run the gamut, and so I gravitate to good storytelling. I think that's more of what I would call it, and so if it becomes a horror, I would like to write more horror, to be honest. I don't know that nothing has come out where this. I mean, novel writing's a discipline. It's a craft, and I don't want to disrespect that aspect or craft of it without taking the time to do that. I mean, I've written a vampire novel, and it'll never see the light of day. I mean, I've written hundreds of thousands of words that never see the light of day.
Okay.
And it's just I when I get the opportunity to sit down and actually map one out and make one happen, I think that's probably I'll gravitate toward next. I don't know though. I mean, something else might come out of me. I know there will be a third book in this series. I've already made that declaration, so I have to stick to that, and that'll be the end. The third book will be the final book. But I beyond that, I'm willing and ready to take on whatever comes my way. I'm very open to trying different things and go, especially, having met so many different people in so many different genres, it just excites you to do whatever, so.
Oh, I totally get that. Yeah. And running a show like this, and as you do, any kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I also think that horror in particular has an interesting kind of dynamic with crime, Yes. I mean, because there's this, like, you're following, because something terrible has to happen in a crime story.
Yeah.
And basically terrible things have to happen, perhaps on the regular, perhaps not even that often in horror stories. They have kind of their kinship there. Yeah.
Even in the psychological aspect, there's kind of a kinship.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, so I guess I'm just sick and twisted, and I like to fuck with people's heads. I don't know. Sorry, I didn't mean...
No, it's an explicit podcast. You can say.
Okay, good. But yeah, I it's just something. What I really gravitate towards. It's, and I guess this is why I can say I'm kind of multi-genre. Is I really gravitate toward telling the story of the person that's in the story and really getting into their head and understanding a different perspective that's not my own. I really like exploring that. That's why I did the first novel as a duality, because I really felt like I hadn't read a crime book that had, it's not uncommon. I'm not the first to ever do it, but I really felt like I hadn't read a book about something like this, a crime like this, without hearing both perspectives. It's usually from one perspective or the other. And I really felt it would be interesting to explore the idea that we have the same narrative told in two different ways. And so that was the idea behind the first book. And then the characters just kind of became lively and became a part of my lexicon, I guess you could call it. And so I just rode that wave and am now developing more with them. But I really felt like that's the motivation that I'm exploring things that I normally wouldn't, explore as a person. Does that make sense?
No, that does. That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's interesting. I feel like maybe sometimes I feel like I've gotten into a rut with writing, or maybe I found my path. It's kind of the two ways I see it,
Mm-hmm.
but it varies by my mood, which one I think I'm actually going through. But branching out is a good way to go, especially when you've got relatively, I don't know, when you're so open, like you said earlier, you're just open to this, to just doing whatever, and then it makes sense to be free with what you're going to write too. I mean, and just put down and explore more characters than just genres, because you can write. I mean, I can speak from experience on this one. If you can write all sorts of genres and still do the same characters, book after book, basically.
Yeah.
Like you got similar characters or characters that fill the similar roles, and that can be healthy too. But I find it's a little less fun than exploring new characters.
I kind of feel that way about Stephen King in a lot of what he writes. You kind of get that same writer, that lonely writer trope that he seems to gravitate toward in a lot of, either in a horror or in a mystery. He kind of uses that trope a lot, and it's always the same tone, that character, and because I think it's him, so I think he just writes what he knows, and there's nothing wrong with that. I don't fault anybody for that. It's just not the way that I write. So.
No, absolutely. I try consciously to branch out sometimes, because I do, like I said before, with the rut, I sometimes feel like I'm just kind of recycling some older ideas, especially when it comes to characters, actually. Mm-hmm. I think it's more because it's so easy to do that, and a lot of my books have tons of characters, like 20 or 30 characters. You count side characters and stuff, but I can have. But actually, some of my favorite works are the one I took the side character and made them the main character,
right.
from another book. I thought, or from an idea that wasn't even written yet. It was like, okay, this guy, he's off in the corner right now. What if he was the hero? That kind of thing. And I think that can be really fun.
I agree. I think that's awesome. I think that's when you know as a writer that you kind of got something, because then you have these multi-layers and dimensions that you can explore and take it in different directions. It doesn't have to be the same direction even. It could go completely sideways or a different way because you're using a different character's perspective, and I think that's kind of fun and unique.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't need to get into it. One of my books, one of my series, the Spells of the Curtain series, is fantasy novellas, and originally the main character of that was going to be a different character who's still in the book, still in the series, and I thought that was but if that character had been the main character, if the original main character had been the main character, then that series would have been a completely different series. It would have been different conflict. Everything would have been completely different, and it's kind of fascinating to think back on it because I wrote that 10 years ago, and I still find it strange to think about. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, with the characters that I wrote for the first book, Amongst the Killing, the two characters that I concentrate on, they were not serial killer or mass murderer versus cop. It was just two people that had a different view on a circumstance, and I was always searching for that edge, and the police procedural edge kind of gave it its life. But it was always about looking at the same story from two sides. That's always how I approached it. I never looked at it as a cop versus, mass murder or cat and mouse kind of thing, but it just fit that idea. So that's how it was born.
No, that's a really good way to think about it too. A good way to express that, I think, because then you're not kind of bringing that bias of like, okay, this guy's the cop, he's got to catch the serial killer,
Yeah.
As the core of the story, and you can have those characters and kind of give them more nuance than you would have if it was Silence of the Lambs again or whatever.
And your point earlier, and I mentioned that I was a screenwriter because of your point earlier, which is that thrillers tend to go really fast. I think my distinct advantage and why thriller just fit me so well was that, especially crime thriller, was that I was a screenwriter, and in screenwriting, you're taught to start the story from the first action that sets the story emotion, and you're telling really that in a 3-act structure. So that was always my thought. So the book really starts from the moment that both of these guys' lives completely change. It doesn't start from I go back and give you a little bit of background on both characters, and they kind of tell, they introduce themselves, but they don't, but it's not giving you all this context, and then you jump into their story. It's their story right from the beginning to the end. So that's
cool.
That's what I enjoyed about writing something like that.
Nice. Yeah. But to shift gears a little bit to what, have you been reading anything interesting lately?
Yeah, actually, because of the nature of what I do, I have to read a lot of stuff, which is something that was kind of a part of why, the little bit of my push to do this, do Go Indie Now was that I was going to be introduced to a lot more artists and their art, and in order to really fully promote them and interview them, I feel like I have to know their art a little bit more. So I read a lot more than I ever have in my life, which is still not enough in my opinion, but it is something, and I believe that every writer should be reading other people's stuff and be reading, period. But I do think it's a skill set that helps you as a writer. But that being said, I just started to, and I'm almost done with a book called The Tear Collector by Sean Burgess, which is really fascinating. It's kind of this Stand By Me meets It kind of story, and it's kind of interesting, and it's really it's really cool in that it's kind of just this coming of age story that's wrapped around a ghost story, which is kind of it's an interesting take on it, and it's very cool. He writes it. He's very polished, and it's kind of interesting because I'm not. I'm terrible. I'm the exact opposite of polished. My stuff is very ragged and some would say it's probably unreadable at times, but which is fine. I fully embrace that criticism. It's just how I am. But he is very on point, very polished, and it's very cool and fascinating to read that kind of perspective. Like I said, finding a different perspective and exploring that is what I like to do. So in finding his book, I've explored that pretty well. So that's pretty cool. And I've read something I read recently that I really, really enjoyed was I've read, there's a few books I've read, but I just think his book is fresh on my mind because that's the one I'm reading currently. So.
Oh, that's cool. That's great. Sounds like an excellent one. Yeah.
It's pretty good. I highly recommend it. Yeah, I'm gonna do a show about it too. So that's why
keep your eye on GoIndieNow for that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I definitely got to pick up some Tim Niederreiter stuff though. I heard that guy's pretty good.
Oh, I don't know who you heard that from. I wouldn't trust that person anymore.
I have a hard time with fantasy and science fiction. It's something that I'm really trying to get over. I read The Dark Archer by Robert Cano, and I really felt like he was like much different in that realm, and I really appreciated that. I mean, stuff like Andy Peliquin is. Andy can get really into like exposition and things like that, but he's really good at writing action and he's really good at writing death. So I try really hard. I just have a hard time with info dumping and world building because I really feel like it litters the story sometimes and kind of bogs it down. And if I get bogged down for a second, you're never going to get me back. And that's the problem that I've had with like Dune and a lot of those epic fantasies are really tough for me to read because I just can't get through all of the conjecture and the info dumping and the world building that surrounds it. And I know that's important stuff, and I know there's a lot.
No, it's not always though. That's the thing. I mean, the more I think about it, the more like the book I just released in September, Demon Scroll, isn't terribly info dumpy. I don't think anyway. There's maybe a little bit of it, but it's mostly pretty concise with that kind of thing.
See, so that's the one I'm
builds gradually. That's kind of why I brought it up. Yeah, that might be the one you want to try if you actually want to check out a Tim Niederreiter book. And we're kind of just segueing elegantly into the plugs. Yeah, Demon Scroll is out there, and it's a good one. And I think, and if you like action and death in your fantasy, well, there's some of that.
Nice. That sounds good.
So where can people find you and your stuff, Joe?
I'm terrible at the author stuff. I don't even have a website for my authoring. I should. But Three Furious Press is my publisher. We currently are on pre-sale for We the Moral Majority, which is the sequel. And that is available on March 12th through Amazon and all the other great places you can get it. I'm hoping a lot more people frequent Smashwords. That's just my personal thing because I'm not a corporatist and I'm not a big fan of the Amazon corporate model. But hey, I know that it's the easiest place to get things and everybody goes there and everybody does it. So it's kind of you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't kind of thing. I think. Yeah. But GoIndieNow.com is where you can find GoIndieNow. We have all of our links there. We're most prevalent on YouTube. If you just type Go Indie Now, either as one word or 3 separate words, will be the first thing that pops up on your YouTube search. And Facebook.com/Go Indie Now. If you really wanted to look up my novel writing and just me as the novel writing, Never Mind the Fine Print is the name of the publishing company or the publishing moniker I put my first book under. So if you go to Facebook.com/Nevermind the Fine Print, and I think it's NMFTP. You can find it. And if you search Joe Compton Amongst the Killing, it'll pop up. So again, that's my first book, Amongst the Killing, which is on all the evil networks, Amazon, and it is available via audiobook, ebook, and paperback. So
wonderful. Thanks for being on the show, Joe. It's been fun.
Thanks, Tim, for having me. Yeah, great conversation. I really appreciate your time.
Oh, you're welcome. And as for everyone else, I will see you and talk to you next week. Bye.
That tears it.